No such threshold standard is able to provide protection to people equally, because little kids, all things being equal, bear about 7 or 8 or 9 times the risk that adults do from the same exposures, for example, to chemicals. People who lead sedentary lives, pregnant women, people with a lot of allergies, all of them bear much higher risk than the average member of the population. If you look at epidemiological studies, you discover that just among people without the differences in, say, allergies, leading up sedentary life, being pregnant, being normal, being a kid, without any of those differences, just average people differ in their sensitivities to, say, chemical hazards by a factor of 200. 200. Okay? So the ethical difficulty is, obviously we have to set a threshold for harm, yet at the same time, it's like we're playing Russian roulette or something with certain members of the population. Certain members of the population, because of their sensitivities, obviously don't receive equal protection. They obviously don't receive equal treatment under the law, because not everybody responds in an average way. Now that's even more of a dilemma if you start to think a little bit about some of the writing that we have done in the philosophical tradition on ethics. Here in the United States, we don't give the same education to every child, do we? We say that some people are retarded or have learning disabilities, and some people are gifted. So we say that, in some sense, equal treatment means treatment that's somehow appropriate to your needs, your merits, or whatever. Okay? So in many areas of life, okay, equal rights obviously are focused on your individual needs and merit. Yet in the area of risk, okay, we're almost doing something like playing Russian roulette because our sensitivities are so different, yet we must set a threshold standard. Now you can see some of what comes up in the threshold dilemma if you look at this slide. You ask in almost any city what the average pollution level is and what the average number of deaths from air pollution are. Okay? And there are 40 or 50,000 deaths a year just from air pollution in the United States. But what you discover that average hides is the fact that areas inhabited by poor people or blacks are areas of much higher air pollution. So my question to you is, how do we regulate risk so that all the standard measures of societal harm don't indicate that we're still hurting the very people who've already been disenfranchised by society? Well, I can tell that some of you are getting tired, it's getting late, so let me try to give you some suggestions for how we might correct these ethical dilemmas and try to do this very, very quickly. One of the things that we can do, for example, to improve the quality of the mathematical and scientific analyses used in probabilistic risk assessment is to do alternative studies. I don't have time to talk about all these examples, but let me just mention the one at the bottom. The government did a study comparing the cost and the risk of nuclear versus coal-generated electricity, and they said that coal was a lot riskier and a lot more expensive. Well, if you do an alternative analysis, you take a very careful look at the economic methods used, and you include in your benefit cost analyses the costs that are normally borne by the government, the cost of storing radioactive waste, for example. It's very easy to show that actually nuclear is a more expensive technology. So what's my proposal? You can improve the quality of mathematical and scientific risk analyses simply by having alternative people do alternative assessments with alternative methodologies. Okay? You might have one assessment done by the Natural Resources Defense Council, and you might have another assessment done by the Office of Technology Assessment, and you might have another assessment done by the coal industry, for example. But the point is, you realize that there's no one objective answer. there are alternative answers, each of which are a function of different methods. And you let the people know that the consequences of using different methods are that you have different policy conclusions. A second suggestion is to try to expose the methodological assumptions that lead to questionable conclusions. Now, let me see if I have my chart on discount rates, because that's a good one. And I'll try to explain this quickly, even though it's a difficult concept. Typically, in probabilistic risk assessment, we are able to say that a particular risk is desirable or undesirable or costly or not costly, because what we do is we discount future deaths. If we say that a particular life here and now is worth, say, $40,000, which the National Traffic and Safety Administration roughly does, its regulations for automobile safety presuppose that if it costs more than $40,000 to save a life, the industry doesn't have to retool to save it. The regulations on the nuclear industry presuppose that each life is worth about $5 million. Okay? So I'm simply saying that all of us, when we do risk assessments, presuppose some value of life. That value of life is not the same across federal agencies or state agencies. It's inconsistent. But, and this is the important point that I'm getting to, when we talk about lives that are lost in the future as a result of some technology, those future lives are not counted the same as our own. If we say a life now is worth $40,000, then a life 20 years from now would be worth the amount that we would have to invest now in order to obtain, at a suitable interest rate, $40,000 20 years from now. Does everybody see what I'm saying? In other words, if you die 20 years from now, you're not worth $40,000. You're worth that small fraction of $40,000, which, if invested now at a given interest rate, would yield you $40,000. Which means, for example, that 1 billion deaths 400 years from now are the same as 1 death next year. So you want to know how we can cost-effectively store radioactive waste, which is lethal, going to be lethal for about 40,000 or more years? Real simple. Real simple. We discount the future cost. And in doing that, we're able to arrive at the conclusion that storing nuclear waste for future generations is not a dangerous or unethical thing to do. So, one of the things we need to do in probabilistic risk assessment is to expose the methodological assumptions to which our risk assessment conclusions are sensitive. Okay? You use different methodological assumptions about discount rates, you get completely different conclusions about what's cost effective and what's not. Let me give you a third suggestion. I'm going to skip this because this requires me to talk about decision theory, and I've already gone on too long, and I'm afraid that some of the students don't know what decision theory is, and I don't mean that as an insult, I just don't want to do that. Okay, another thing that we can do is when we do our benefit cost analyses, which are always a part of the third stage of probabilistic risk assessment, we can weight those benefit cost analyses in terms of ethical constraints. So that, for example, we have the consent dilemma that I told you about, where poor people and uneducated people tend to end up in risky occupations. So if we do a benefit cost analysis for the effectiveness of particular pollution control regulations in a particular occupational environment, what we should do is add a highly negative weight of cost in that particular situation, a cost that is proportional to the degree to which it is likely that those people didn't give free informed consent to the risk. So right now our situation is that benefit cost analysis has been mandated by the government. I'm sure many of you don't agree with using benefit cost analysis. But my point is, if you have to use it, if it's mandated by the government, then the least you can do is try to make your numbers show some of the ethical problems that in the past were covered up by the numbers. So use ethical weights. There's some good economists at places like Resources for the Future who have showed that if you use different weighting criteria, some ethical weighting criteria based on Rawls, some based on Bentham, some on Pareto, according as you use different ethical theories to weight your different actions or your different pollution control regulations, you can generate completely different conclusions about what is cost effective. And that's fascinating. That means that we as a people ought to be making decisions about what ethical theories we want to weight our decisions about science and technology. And one way to do it is to do alternative risk assessments so that people say, oh, this is the conclusion you get about cost effectiveness if you follow John Rawls. This is the conclusion you get about cost effectiveness if you follow Adam Smith. This is the conclusion you get about cost effectiveness if you follow Pareto. This is the conclusion you get about cost effectiveness if you follow Nozick. Okay? But the point is to pull all these methodological value judgments out, the ethical judgments out, and let people see some of the effects of it. And that's just a crude solution to a difficult problem. I'm going to skip that. Well, no, let me use it quickly. Let me just use it quickly, even though I don't want to go on too long. Typically, what people who do probabilistic risk assessment assume is that as the annual probability of fatality increases, you have a proportional increase in the value of risk avoidance. They assume there's a really simple-minded, linear relationship between probability of fatality and the value of risk avoidance, that as the probability of dying goes up, the value of avoiding that risk increases. Well, what I'm trying to say with these ethical weighting criteria is that there is no simple linear relationship, that people have to take account of things like consent and weight risks to which people have been given free informed consent much more negatively. Weight risks that contribute to this contributor's dilemma, that contribute synergistically to undesirable health effects, weight them more negatively, for example. But this is the alternative to some sort of weighting scheme, this crude thing that we have right now. Another alternative that I have, and this really makes scientists mad at me, another alternative is to calibrate scientists. You know how you calibrate? Any of you ever calibrated any of the instruments that you've used in the lab or in the field in science courses? Well, what I'm suggesting is that we calibrate risk assessors. Now, what that means is that probabilistic risk assessors vary in their estimates of risk, as I told you before, between roughly 3 and 6 orders of magnitude. Okay? So what I'm suggesting we do is that we figure out whose predictions have been correct in the past, and then on the basis of their past predictive successes, we attempt to weight the expert judgment of risk assessors about current and future societal risk. Now, one very good reason for doing that is that a lot of studies have shown that people who tend to be optimistic in one area are optimistic in another area. And there's a very close relationship among assessors' probability estimates in a variety of different areas. They show a lot of dependence in a probabilistic and statistical sense. So if we begin calibrating risk assessors, that would be a great thing to do. Some of you probably know Teddy Seidenfeld from the Philosophy of Science Association, but Teddy has been working with people at Johns Hopkins, and he's calibrating surgeons, and he's putting weights on different surgeons on the basis of their previous successful surgeries, and of course attempting to control for different variables among the patients. But I would love, in my consumer reports, to get the calibration figures on different medical doctors before I went to them. right? So what I'm suggesting is that this is another vehicle for using past frequency and past predictions to sort of calibrate people for the future. One reason why calibration is so important is that most of the risks that we face are very low probability risks, and they're associated with new technologies. So we don't have an established frequency record for accidents or injuries. So we really have to sort of guesstimate, and a good way to guesstimate, given the dependency among a given assessor's estimates, is to use how successful these folks have been in the past. Okay. So in other words, in calibration, we use the frequencies of past events or ingredient events in a sort of scoring rule to calibrate probability estimates for the same events. When people did a famous probabilistic risk assessment of nuclear power, the most famous one that's ever been done, the estimates of the different experts, largely from MIT, working on the study, the estimates of those estimates differed from roughly 3 to 6 orders of magnitude. And now that we've been generating nuclear electricity for, ever since 1955, we have a good idea of the respects in which those probabilistic risk assessors were right and the way they were wrong. A friend of mine, a mathematician in the Netherlands, got all the data from Oak Ridge Labs in Tennessee on the accidents in U.S. nuclear facilities, and then he took that frequency record of accidents and compared the accident frequency record to the estimated accidents of particular, like failure of a pipe, stainless steel pipe of 3 inches in diameter. There were all kinds of different systems that could have failed. And essentially what he did was check the frequency that actually existed against the earlier predicted values. And he discovered that, again, the assessors were typically off 3 to 6 orders of magnitude. And then he developed a way to calibrate these assessors. What I find is interesting is that the U.S. didn't bother to do that itself. And you find that we do lots of technology assessment, but nobody ever goes back and does Monday morning quarterbacking because the scientific community is so powerful, they don't want anybody checking up on them. But risk assessors in the Netherlands did do that. This is an example of some of the work from the Netherlands. It's just being published this year by Oxford University Press. Mathematician who did it is a guy named Roger Cook. But you can see that that some of the experts' estimates were way, way, way out of value. Not 90%, but a majority of the accidents that they predicted were outside the 90% confidence intervals. In other words, they weren't very reliable. You can see why you need to calibrate experts if you look at the spread in this data. The difference in estimates is so great. Now, I'm going to close with this, and we're very near the end because I don't want to go on and on and on. I can see you getting tired. But this shows how successful people have been when we tried to calibrate meteorologists, weather forecasters. In other words, when you told forecasters how correct they were and what they got wrong, they improved. And you can see the way they improved from one year to the next based on getting feedback and being calibrated. So that's the one area that I was able to dig up any data on calibration. But most people, when you give them instantaneous feedback about their performance, do learn to do things differently. It's just interesting that we require this of our meteorologists, but we don't require this of our probabilistic risk assessors. So that, in a nutshell, concludes some of the ways that I have to take account for both some of the ethical problems and some of the technical problems. Let me stop there, even though I'm not done, and see if anybody wants to disagree with me or ask questions or see what you want to say at this point. Anybody? Anybody want to disagree? Or you think I've been too easy on technology? A lot of environmentalists tell me that. Yeah.
You said that cancer rate's been going up in the last few years. What about life expectancy, the average lifespan?
Life expectancy has leveled off, which most people don't know. Although we're making a lot of progress, you see life expectancy. Let me clarify that statement. Life expectancy, in one sense, has been going up, but that has been due to things like gains in nutrition, sanitation, controlling certain sorts of cancers. But the way that we should expect life expectancy to go up, given the progress that we've made in those other areas, is not proportionate, because while we're gaining in areas like sanitation, for example, we're losing in all these other areas that have to do with pollution. So you'll find some very modest increases in life expectancy, but on the whole, life expectancy is leveling off, and there've not been significant changes probably for at least 10 years. Although you'll read in the paper that, say life expectancy for women has gone up a year or two or something like that.
What order of magnitude is cancer gone up in contrast?
Well, I don't want to talk about order of magnitude, and one reason why I don't want to speak that specifically, I prefer to just say it's gone up, is because the Office of Technology Assessment suggests that we weren't diagnosing cancers correctly earlier in the century, and moreover, they know that given increasing levels of pollutants, although they can't always say, they can almost never say that an individual cancer was caused by a particular pollutant, using the dose-response curves that they do say on animals and extrapolating to humans, they can say that given increasing levels of pollutants, there's been a corresponding increase in cancer. But I don't recall that they were willing to commit themselves to a particular level.
I guess the spirit of what I'm getting at is, if you take a primitive society that doesn't have all these technologies, yeah, their chances of getting cancer is a lot less, but their life expectancy is much less as well, which is more significant.
Yeah, that's a really, really, really good point. That's one reason why I wanted to say that a lot of these problems are really dilemmas. Getting health care delivery systems is something that usually occurs in a sophisticated technological society that also has a lot of pollution. And so that's why, you'll have people voting to keep their jobs in the logging industry and get rid of the spotted owl, or to keep their jobs at the aluminum smelter, even though it's going to, kill some of their children, because there's always some benefits that come from any particular risk that we bear. And the problem is not a simple-minded one of shutting industry down or having zero pollution. That's just not going to work. It's a question of how you balance risks and benefits and where the trade-offs are. And also, I don't even think the question is so important, the question of magnitude of risk is as important as the distribution of risk. I think it's more important that the risk be distributed equitably than that we reduce overall risk. But you can see all these classical problems of ethics all of a sudden just shooting up, because you have a vast number of people who can pollute without someone being able to pin the good specifically on them and saying that this pollution caused that cancer. But you're right about the standard of living and the benefit. And that's exactly why I use the word dilemma.
Another example was, you used an argument that people in the factories and stuff are exposing themselves to risk, but they're getting compensated. Once you consider that, them making that a personal choice in their own free will, not so much required, but, choosing. I mean,
well, that's why I said
that
that's why I said the sociological data indicates unequivocally that as education goes up, okay, and job mobility, job opportunities go up, the people who choose those risky jobs goes down. That's my whole point. Smart people with options don't take risky jobs. I mean, unless they do it for pleasure. I go scuba diving. I have a brother who, parachutes. I mean, so that's different. But But people with options and freedom and education, they're going to risk their neck for stupid things. I mean, all the data indicates that. So that's the problem, you know. Do those people in the factory really consent?
That's my opinion, but I think so. I think most of them probably smoke too. People,
Yeah. Think about the conditions. This is a really interesting ethical question, though. Think about the conditions for free informed consent. The only way people interfere with your consent, you know, is not holding your arms behind your back or putting a bullet to your head. People also mark your ballot in psychological and sociological and political ways. Women have their ballots marked from the very beginning in certain ways. So do men. People have their ballots marked about what's socially acceptable, you know. So who was it who just told me that they were, yeah, you said you were in England and there were a lot of people smoking. I suppose it's cool to smoke. And if you're insecure and you want to be cool, I guess you smoke. But that's a way that we have of societally having our ballots marked, having our choices made in ways that certainly restrict our freedom.
You're talking about the sociological pressure in that example?
Yeah, and we in part create some of that sociological pressure. The society creates part of that pressure. And presumably what we want to do, I think, is create a situation in which more people are authentically free. Right? Not just from guns, but from undesirable pressures or whatever. But just try to think about the ways in which your freedom is limited by things that you don't see. I think that's something we need to think about. Anyway, yeah.
A while ago, Barry Commoner was here, and he was kind of pessimistic. He felt, I think I've got him right, he agreed with you that there were these thousands of chemicals that pollute and endanger us. And his view was regulation never works. You have to aim for elimination. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that for a minute.
The difficulty is you can't eliminate everything.
He claimed you could, but you'd have to pay, in line with what this gentleman said, you'd have to pay with your standard of living. You'd have to be willing to have a lower gross national product, for example.
Well, maybe you could eliminate some of the worst hazards. But just to give you another...
Just chemicals is all he was talking about.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you could eliminate some of the
Pesticides
worst
and that sort of thing.
chemicals, pesticides, and maybe we would have to accept a lower standard of living. Yeah.
But we never think of that in terms of risk assessment, right? It's a given that we can accept some level of DDT, DDT did get banned. But his attitude is that if you allow some, then there's going to be all kinds of fudging like you were talking about, and they're going to establish higher and higher standards of acceptability.
Yeah.
And that the only way to really protect ourselves better is to just say, he likes DDT as the model. Just get rid of it. There is no more DDT allowed. And he thinks we should do that for all sorts of things, the names of which I forget that you are conversant with.
Yeah. The difficulty with that is I'm not sure that all people in all situations would say that's the greater good. Let me give you an example. 1/3 of the pesticides we make in this country are banned for use in the United States. Banned and not licensed. They don't apply for a license because they know they wouldn't get through. So 1/3 that we produce are banned for use in this country. They're shipped abroad. 40,000 people a year, according to the World Health Organization, die from pesticides. Those people are largely in developing nations. The pesticides typically come from multinational companies and from the U.S. companies. And the question is, should those companies ship those pesticides abroad? And I just don't know that the answer is easier in all situations, because once you start thinking about second and third and fourth order effects, once you start thinking about a bloody half loaf of bread being better than no bread at all, I lose my confidence that what is right in this place in terms of banning is right everywhere else. I mean, it may be that people would starve to death, or lower their longevity by 20 years, or, 3 times as many of their children would die if they didn't use this pesticide. And they can't use integrated pest management in countries where they can't even boil their water. I just don't know. I don't know. I don't know that that works for all situations. I think you've got to do a lot of balance. I think you have to do ethical analysis. I think the ethical equivalent of the fundamentalist who has a quick and easy answer for everything, the ethical equivalent of that fundamentalist is an environmentalist or an industry person who just has one answer. And the hard way is analysis in every situation.
I don't have any problem with your corrective measures, but in a way, I think I noticed an absence of one. And that is, they all seem to be designed to leave the range of variability of analysis in place, and then kind of protect from it. Is that because you think converging, examining assumptions and getting people talking about the kinds of assumptions they're making and improving the character of the assumptions would narrow that down? Do you think that's impossible, or just it would take too long to be practical, or just?
I think that if people have to fight about assumptions and defend them, that most assumptions can't stand the scrutiny of the light of day. And once those come out, like these discount rates, they'd be gone in a minute. If most of the members of the American public knew about the standard assumptions that were associated with discounting, we'd never hear about discounting again. I'm convinced of that. I don't think I truly don't think often it's a question of sophisticated ethical problems. In many cases, it's a question of just opening up esoteric methods to public scrutiny and making clear what's going on. And I guess I have a naive assumption of a liberal intellectual that once people see this, it will all stop. I don't know if that may be wrong. I don't know. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's something that I worry about. Is that much of what you're suggesting here is to be clearer about what the risks are. And it strikes me that many of the problems aren't simply a matter of understanding what the risks are, but gaining the political power in order to make our judgments about what kinds of risks one can take. Can you address that?
Yeah, I can. And a lot of people don't like this either, but I guess I believe more in populist democracy than I do in the imposition of environmentalism. And I believe that you can educate people and empower them to correct their situation. But I don't believe that a dictator or call for political change or that sort of thing is desirable, or that will work. A lot of people say to me, well, why don't you just say, don't do this or you can't do that? Well, I'm not sure that's effective. I'm also not sure that if people vote to hurt themselves, they shouldn't be allowed to do so, even though I wouldn't want to do it. So I prefer to expose things to the light of day and let people be aware of what's going on. I'm also an incrementalist. I don't believe that some of the most sweeping changes that are needed in this society are going to come with any sort of rapidity. I do believe that at a minimum, people have a right to know, and that that's the first step in a long, slow, incremental process. I guess I just don't believe very much in revolutions or conversions, but I do believe in slow changes.
Do you think the regulatory measures or mechanisms are in place that once these things become public, really could change?
Oh, I think once the public's aware of what goes on, often the outcry is so great that the regulations end up getting changed. If the public outcry and the public education is great, then I don't know what else you can do except become a fascist and impose your environmentalism on other people. That's an unfair way of putting it, perhaps, but I think it comes down ultimately to whether you believe more in your own philosophy or whether you are more dedicated to populist democracy, even when it's wrong. And that's a big value judgment.
No, you,
Yeah.
I guess in your last remarks are puzzling me just a little bit. I'm wondering, can you just sketch out a little bit what would happen if you perfected risk assessment in the manner you suggested? I'm not clear what the result would be. What would we know? Would we know that we have a chart at the end with these new factors in it, which the ethical aspect and the calibrated forecasters. We have a chart, and we know something about nuclear energy versus coal. What do we know exactly? We know that coal is better than nuclear energy, that it's irrational to use nuclear energy. I mean, if we perfected in the direction you're headed, where would democracy then fit in? I mean, if we actually have the calculus in place,
Okay.
why vote?
Okay. Presumably what we do is alternative assessment, and right now we have a whole structure of administrative law and federal regulatory agencies, and I think those need to be changed in terms of some system of adversary assessment with alternative assessments being done. That's what was built into my claim about alternative assessments. And my point is that I'm not sure that people would make better decisions, but I think if they saw how sensitive the alleged conclusions of experts really are to very controversial value judgments, that they would be likely to disagree. And I think the pattern for probabilistic risk assessment right now, or for government through federal regulatory agencies like the Food and Drug Administration, for example, the pattern is for the experts to deliver us some dictum which is presented as being objective, and we're somehow forced to conform. And it seems to me if we moved into a system of adversary assessment, which has already been tried in some communities in the United States, if we moved into that mode of operation, what would happen is that the experts as such would not be listened to so much as the folks doing the alternative assessments who could make clear the degree to which our different assumptions control our different conclusions. In other words, science could be seen to be political, which in large part I think it is. And once that we're seeing, one of the trump cards of the scientific military industrial complex would be taken away.
I just need a little bit of clarification.
Yeah.
When you introduced that idea of having variable schemes, a variety of schemes, a variety of
Right.
experts, I thought that you were doing that in the name of moving the assessment procedures towards greater perfection. And now it seems it's slightly different. If you're introducing skepticism.
Yeah,
into it.
but you typically only get alternative methodological assumptions from people with alternative philosophical points of view. If you ask a neoclassical economist to do a probabilistic risk assessment that has to do with energy demand, he's going to tell you that energy consumption in the future is going to be just the way it was in the past, regardless of the price of electricity. If you get somebody else who's far more skeptical about those methods from a completely different social or political group, perhaps also a practicing economist, but an institutionalist or something else, then you're going to get different methodological assumptions. My only claim is that you're going to get alternative methodological assumptions mainly from different interest groups. When you read the probabilistic risk assessments done by industry versus environmentalists versus government, that's just very, very clear. But you're right. Maybe if you ask different groups, you wouldn't get alternative methodological assumptions, but that's what I've seen, that the methodological assumptions are pretty predictable on the basis of the group that's doing the study. Not that they're doing something that's not objective, it's just every time they have a choice, they make a choice that in the end will serve their own ends, it seems to me. Yeah.
Same thing, follow up. Agree that add competing probability assessments, competing persons and so forth, with competing improve things, calibrate the scholars and so forth. I just would suggest that see, for example, the discounting might represent a value that we all share. Why not put off until tomorrow what you should be doing today?
Right.
So it sounds, I definitely agree that push forward with those sort of suggestions. I just wonder if it might not be
Yeah, I mean,
the outcome.
Yeah, what you're really saying is this is not going to create enough change. I agree, but what short of coercion will?
Exactly.
And it's like what Thomas Jefferson says, if you see that the people are making the right decisions, the solution is not to take the power away from them, the solution is to educate. So that's why I began by saying, there's 40,000 to 50,000 murders every year. There's an order of magnitude greater number of cancers, but we don't call them murder. I don't know. That's one thing we can do to get people to think about what they do when they drive their cars or spray their vegetables or whatever it is that they do that adds to the risk burden that we all bear. But you may be right. Maybe we won't change.
I wasn't
don't
being
know.
skeptical, I was being cynical.
Yeah, I don't know. Look at the way people have changed with respect to cigarette smoking now. That's phenomenal. Don't you think that's phenomenal? Cigarette manufacturers have to go to third world. Well, you don't see it as much as in Iowa, but believe me, I've lived in California and Florida, and people don't smoke anymore.
What do you think of the ethics of society preventing the tobacco industry? And if 49% of these half-million cancers are caused by smoking, if we want to talk about cost benefits, it looks like that's where we ought to put our money.
Yeah, I don't see how people can justify cigarette smoking given the passive deaths that are induced. You've seen the Environmental Protection Agency statistics on passive death. They're incredible.
But there's an example where the education's there and it's not solving the problem.
It is there. If you look at the statistics on cigarette smoking, you know who the smokers are? They're either older people who can't break the habit because it's an addiction, and they're primarily people from very low socioeconomic and educational brackets. Statistically, that's the case. The higher the level of education, the lower the incidence of smoking. I've seen the data. Smokers are very poor people and old people who can't break. Statistically, that's the case. So, I mean, it is working in a sense.
That's a
In a
majority,
sense.
but there's still a percentage that's
Yeah, I mean, it's statistically the case, but but it's still that you educate people enough so that U.S. cigarette manufacturers, to avoid going under, have to market their product in third world countries and rely on ads to people who are dumb enough to pay attention to them. Yeah, most people don't. There's hundreds of little facts like that you probably.
That's really awful.
That's really weird.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it's really
awful.
weird.
But basically, we hear all that and lock up the door, we're comfortable. It goes out of your mind. I mean, even if you know those horrible things, you still know tomorrow doing some of the things you know that are bad and paying to that company that does that.
Yeah, but things
So it affects you
change.
personally.
Things change little by little by little, Maybe somebody will worry about the discount rate, and in a few years, we will have mandates about the way these analyses can be done. Let me give you an example. In 1969, we passed the National Environmental, NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act. That mandated that we do environmental impact analysis. It also mandated that we take account of the distributive inequities among people that resulted from certain environmental impacts. They mandated that because of demands of the people. I wouldn't consider it unlikely that in an amendment to NEPA, somebody mandate that we stop using a discount rate. That will come. History has shown a continual evolution in our recognition of the rights of people. Look at how long it's taken us to recognize the interests of blacks and Jews and gypsies and leftists and women. That's all in the insane. I mean, things are coming, things are changing. It takes a long time. Okay.
I was just thinking the nuclear power industry, in some ways this country, it was brought to a halt by a bunch of people who really were afraid of it, but also kept doing things about it. And it wasn't 3 Mile Island itself, it was the fact that at the same time as 3 Mile Island, the actual cost, all the hidden
Right.
costs the government was burning, were brought out. And people had to look at it more and more. And so they found what was it, Diablo Canyon